Hey, what's going on, everybody? So we're back and we're continuing to look at the motion that Steve Greenberg has filed to have this case dismissed. And the next issue that he actually raises in his motion, he basically points out that in order for an organization to be considered a criminal enterprise, it has to have three structural pieces or three structural components. And number one is a purpose, right? So there has to be a purpose for the criminal organization, and that purpose has to be some criminal objective, right? So the second component in order to show that the organization was a criminal enterprise is that it must basically prove that there was some type of criminal relationship among the people associated in the enterprise. The one of the problems with the organization is that these are employees of the organization, and they're not merely just people who were criminals or acting in a criminal manner solely for a criminal purpose and being associated in that manner, right? And then the other thing that he points out that there has to be longevity with the people that are involved in the organization, and this longevity would have allowed them to achieve their criminal objectives. So, and then he basically goes on to say the first common purpose alleges to promote R. Kelly's music and to promote the R. Kelly brand and to recruit women and girls to engage in illegal activity with Kelly. And he basically says this fails because it's clearly not unlawful to promote music or brand, and the superseding indictment is silent on how any other individual benefit from Mr. Kelly's alleged activity with the girls, right? So just moving right along on this, it basically says that it's silent as to the identity of any alleged members, and he's pointed out that they actually haven't named any of the people in the organization, right? So basically, given that the indictment names only one individual, and basically that person is R. Kelly, and there's no way for the court to make a determination on whether or not the enterprise was a criminal enterprise that would fall under the RICO statute, because you're only naming one person and you're not presenting any other individuals before the court so that they could be inspected and evaluated to determine if they themselves were criminals in nature or they acted criminally, or whether or not they were just employees. So you haven't really submitted any other names beyond R. Kelly's name. And just moving on, basically it says a party cannot be both a defendant person and the enterprise, and this is basically relating to some case law which he basically cites here. I understand this to mean that you can't be both. You have to be one or the other. Otherwise, the RICO statute doesn't stick, right? You can't be a person who's committed all these egregious crimes and then they're going to turn around and say, well, this organization committed these egregious crimes, right? So he's basically showing case law where they've actually won on appeal, affirming dismissal of a RICO claim where the plaintiff failed to identify an enterprise distinct or different from the defendant. So you have to choose. You can't have both. As a prosecutor, you have to pick one or the other. Either he was an individual that committed all these egregious crimes, or he was a part of an enterprise that committed all these crimes. You have to pick here. And if you don't, you're trying to push both, and the defendant can't be the same person as the enterprise. Moving right along here, basically, courts generally recognize the defendant may be a member of a large association, in fact, enterprise, without violating the person enterprise distinction. But but all have held that the defendant must conduct the enterprise affairs and not merely his own affairs. So again, this goes back to what he was saying earlier. R. Kelly was basically conducting his own business. He was the sole owner of his own business. He may have had partners and some other subsidiaries or some additional corporations, but for the most part, he was managing his own music. He was basically managing his tours, and he had employees that basically helped him with the management of his business and his tours, right? So so again, he can't be the person that's committed all these crimes and be the enterprise at the same time. And even if you just take the charges from the perspective of the enterprise doesn't really work here. The RICO charges don't work here because, again, these people were employed by R. Kelly. They were doing his official business, and basically there was no criminal relationship between R. Kelly and his employees. He also goes on to say Mr. Kelly directed or managed the affairs of an enterprise that is distinct from himself as a person. The superseding indictment does not identify a single person that worked with Mr. Kelly either by name or pseudonym, nor does it allege that a single action taken in furtherance of the conspiracy was performed by anyone other than Mr. Kelly. Without a difference between the defendant and the enterprise, there can be no violation of the RICO statute, right? Dismissing where the enterprise was not adequately specified. And again, this is basically straightforward, and it's the same thing that he's kind of reiterated throughout the entire motion. And then finally, he ends this, and he ends it by basically saying RICO is only being used in this case in an effort to subvert various statute of limitations. R. Kelly is not an enterprise, right? So this is pretty much it. This is the meat of his motion. uh, he's basically saying that R. Kelly is not an enterprise. He's a guy who owns a business. So this is basically the same thing that Greenberg has been saying throughout the motion. Basically, he's saying that R. Kelly did not have a criminal enterprise. He had a legitimate business, and he basically managed his business and his employees to basically promote his brand and the music. And you're simply just using the RICO statute so you can bring up all this old stuff that are essentially beyond the statute of limitations, and you're trying to bring in the RICO statute simply for a strategic advantage.